Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, actuellement, le Port du Québec contribue à maintenir 8 000 emplois dans la grande région du Québec. Les projets du terminal de croisière et de la promenade du Foulon, appuyés par notre parti en campagne, sont importants.
Excuse me, sorry, on n'a pas la traduction, interprétation. Alors maintenant, ça fonctionne. S'il vous plaît, recommencez.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Actuellement, le Port du Québec contribue à maintenir 8 000 emplois dans la grande région du Québec. Les projets du terminal de croisière et de la promenade du Foulon, appuyés par notre parti en campagne, sont importants pour la prospérité du port. Présentement, le port attend toujours une réponse du gouvernement libéral. Le Premier ministre peut-il assurer aux gens du Québec qu'il ne va pas s'y traîner les pieds et mettre en péril des emplois quand il le fait allure au pays?
Honorable ministre des Transports.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous reconnaissons certainement l'importance du port de Québec, un port important dans le fleuve Saint-Laurent et qui fait partie effectivement de la stratégie maritime de la province du Québec. Un port qui est important du point de vue de la livraison de produits en vrac et aussi, comme mon collègue l'a mentionné, dans l'industrie des croisières. Alors, nous sommes en train d'examiner cette demande et nous prendrons une décision effectivement dans un avenir rapproché. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Honorable Leader de l'Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in Edmonton, the Prime Minister was asked a very direct question. His response or his non-response was very troubling. Troubling to every resource worker that's laid off, all of their families that are worrying about where their next paycheck will come from. So he couldn't bring himself to say yes yesterday, so I'm going to ask him here one more time. If job-creating energy projects get through his new process at the National Energy Board, will the Liberal cabinet also approve them? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we find it pretty ironic that the members from the opposite side who weren't able to get resources to Tidewater over 9 years are talking about what we're trying to do. We are looking for a way to actually get resources to Tidewater. We've been very clear about this point. We are working hard to get the license required to do that, and we are convinced our approach will make a real difference for people in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, and across this country.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here's the problem. He already has a record of blocking job-creating energy projects. Northern Gateway was approved with 204 conditions, but then the Prime Minister killed it with his unilateral transportation ban off the West Coast.
That's right.
So that's his record.
Killing jobs.
It would do a lot more for investor confidence and public confidence if the government would actually stand behind their own process.
Right.
So I ask again, if new projects get through this new process, will they be approved by the Liberal government, yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the honourable member, here's the real problem. The real problem was they weren't able to do anything over 9 years in getting resources to market. On what basis do they have any credibility in asking us how we're going to do it? We are going to take an approach that's actually going to get resources to Tidewater. We're going to make a difference for the people who need us to make a difference across this country, creating real economic growth through getting our resources to market.
Honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le moins qu'on puisse dire, c'est que le ministre des Transports a été pour le moins flou tout à l'heure quant au financement du port de Québec. Mais à Québec, il n'y a pas uniquement les gens du port qui attendent des nouvelles de ce gouvernement-là. Il y a l'Institut national d'optique de Québec, un endroit très important qui génère des emplois. Près de 4 000 emplois ont été générés par ce centre de recherche et de développement appliqué. Alors, Monsieur le Président, si les gens du port doivent attendre, est-ce que l'INO, qui a besoin de ce financement d'ici le 31 mars, va enfin avoir une réponse positive de ce gouvernement?
The Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker,
Speaker, I want to thank the member for the question. I understand the great work done by this institute. It does great work to commercialize very innovative ideas to market to help SMEs, Mr. Speaker. We've had a very productive conversation with them, and we'll provide them with a timely response with regards to funding, Mr. Speaker. We understand the importance of growing the economy. We understand the importance of innovation and creating jobs, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to work with this institute and other institutes across the country.
C'est bien beau les paroles, mais ça prend des engagements, parce qu'il n'y a pas uniquement le port, il n'y a pas uniquement l'INO, mais il y a également l'Université Laval qui a besoin d'un financement pour l'Institut nordique. Monsieur le Président, ce sont des engagements du Parti libéral qui n'ont toujours pas été accomplis. Les gens de Québec veulent avoir des réponses. Jusqu'à présent, le bilan libéral depuis 100 jours à Québec, c'est 0 plus 0 égale 0. Quand le gouvernement va livrer la marchandise pour les gens de Québec?
Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, our #1 priority is the economy. We will make investments in aerospace, automotive, byproducts, biopharmaceuticals, business services, chemicals and plastics, digital media, financial services, food and beverage, media devices, mining industries, oil and gas, renewable energy, retail, software. Mr. Speaker, I can continue to go on and on. The bottom line is we'll grow the economy and create jobs.
Honorable député d'Outremont.
Canadians learned today that it's upwards of 3,000 Indigenous people who suffered abuse in residential schools who have had their claims denied because of a technicality. It was the Justice Department that came up with this loophole and argued against these victims in court. This is contrary to the spirit of reconciliation and a violation of the Residential Schools Agreement. Will the Justice Minister instruct her officials to back down? Will she also apologize for this tactic and provide the compensation these survivors are entitled to?
Honorable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member across the way for the question and certainly the passion that he expresses with respect to Indigenous people. I think without question I share that same passion, as does our government, to ensure that we implement the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in a timely way and in a fair way. And as the Minister of Justice, I take very seriously my commitments to follow through with our commitments in the election to ensure that we're compliant with the Charter and to ensure that there's fairness. And I've instructed my hardworking and dedicated officials to come up with options to remedy this situation, working with the Minister of Indigenous.
Member for Outremont.
I thank the Minister for her answer, but she says in a timely way. Does she not think these victims have already waited enough, Mr. Speaker? Monsieur le Président, hier, le gouvernement a signé le partenariat transpacifique qui ajouterait des centaines de millions de dollars de coûts, selon une étude qui vient d'être publiée, au régime public d'assurance médicaments. Question simple pour le gouvernement. Entend-il, oui ou non, compenser les provinces pour l'augmentation des frais qui seraient imposés à leur système d'assurance médicaments?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire du Commerce international.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'honorable membre d'Outremont pour sa question. Nous allons étudier le PTP devant ce Parlement à travers un comité de Parlement et en consultation avec les Canadiens et Canadiennes. Évidemment, nous allons regarder l'impact sur des secteurs particuliers et nous allons étudier non seulement les défis, mais aussi les solutions si jamais on décide de ratifier l'accord.
Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement libéral signe l'accord transpacifique, négocié en secret par les conservateurs, sans même avoir fait d'études d'impact économique. Les innovateurs et créateurs canadiens craignent de perdre des milliards en laissant le haut du pavé aux États-Unis en matière de propriété intellectuelle. Le fondateur de BlackBerry a même décrit l'entente comme étant, et je le cite, « la pire politique jamais adoptée ». Pourquoi le premier ministre s'entête à signer un accord que nous savons va nuire à nos emplois en innovation au Canada?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'honorable membre d'Outremont pour sa question. Oui, nous allons étudier l'impact du PTP. C'est ce que nous avons fait avec des consultations depuis le 19 octobre. C'est ce qu'on a fait lors de la campagne électorale. C'est ce qu'on va faire à travers le comité du commerce international devant ce Parlement. L'importance est de ratifier ou non l'accord. Ce n'est pas important de signer, c'est plutôt important de ratifier. C'est une décision qu'on va prendre avec étude.
Honorable député d'Outremont.
Est-ce que ça arrive souvent aux députés de signer des affaires avec lesquelles il n'est pas d'accord? Monsieur le Président, after promising openness and accountability, the Liberals signed on to a trade deal negotiated in secret with no economic impact study. He just admitted it. He wants to do the study after signing, and no mandate from Canadians to sign. Now that they have signed, further changes are impossible. Since they're gambling with Canadian jobs, perhaps it was appropriate that they signed it in a casino. Will the government admit they have just signed away any possibility of making changes to the wrong-headed conservative trade deal?
Yeah.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, it's true that the previous government negotiated this accord in secret, but it's also true that the honourable member from Outremont decided to not support the agreement without having even read it. We have promised the Canadian public. We promised the Canadian public during the election that we would study the agreement, we would look at all aspects of the agreement in depth, and that is precisely, Mr. Speaker, what we have done and what we are going to continue to do.
The member from Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the first Finance Committee meeting today, on our suggestion, it was agreed that we do some pre-budget consultations, bringing in witnesses from across Canada. The suggestion was made as well, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Finance appear at the committee. My question to the Minister is this: will he take the invitation and appear before the committee for pre-budget consultations?
Great question.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, 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 order. Order. Let's stay calm here, folks. Let's stay cool. It's Thursday. We're almost at Friday. The Honourable Minister of Finance has the floor. Please listen.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for her question. I can tell you that I have done an enormous number of pre-budget consultations across this country. I mean, I've traveled from coast to coast. We've seen people from all sectors of the economy. I've listened more than any Minister of Finance has ever listened in the history of this country. We've had 3,500 budget submissions.
The Honourable Member from Milton.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I found that really funny. It's going to be hard for kind of weird. So one of the things that I did note in committee, though, today, Mr. Speaker, in all fairness, was we don't want pre-budget consultations at the committee to hold up the budget. Canadians want a budget. They want a plan. They want to know what's going on.
Absolutely.
So my question to the Minister of Finance is pretty simple. Do you feel like you have the ability to actually make a decision and tell us when the budget will be?
Great question.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member for her question. I'd like to remind her what happened last year when the budget was actually announced far after the traditional season.
That's right.
This year, what we're doing is we are working to listen to Canadians as best we can. We've heard from thousands upon thousands of Canadians. We've had 3,500 submissions. We owe it to Canadians to actually go through those submissions. We are doing so, and we will get to the budget as expeditiously as we can, recognizing our challenging economic environment.
Monsieur le Président, nous voudrions savoir ce que le ministre des Finances a à dire. La Chambre débat aujourd'hui d'une motion d'opposition découlant de la revue financière de Finance Canada, qui indique clairement que le gouvernement conservateur a laissé un surplus. Cependant, les députés de ce gouvernement continuent à nier la vérité. Est-ce que le ministre des Finances va donner l'exemple, se lever et dire à cette Chambre qu'il fait confiance aux représentants de son propre ministère? Peut-il dire que le gouvernement a hérité d'un surplus d'1 milliard de dollars?
Honorable ministre des Finances.
Monsieur le Président, les seules personnes qui croient que le gouvernement conservateur précédent a laissé un surplus sont les conservateurs eux-mêmes. Les Canadiens ne sont pas dupes. Ne vous méprenez pas. Le gouvernement du Canada va afficher un déficit pour l'année fiscale 2015-2016 et ce déficit repose sur les actions et inactions prises par le gouvernement précédent. Cela est un fait.
Monsieur le Président, les Canadiens soutiennent les investissements dans l'infrastructure, mais peu de Canadiens soutiennent des déficits inutiles qui visent à financer les projets de prédilection des libéraux. Nous savons que quand les déficits augmentent, la confiance dans la capacité de gestion du gouvernement diminue, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, tout indique que le gouvernement va accuser un déficit de plus de 20 milliards de dollars. Est-ce que le ministre des Finances va dire à cette Chambre que c'est faux? À combien va s'élever le déficit libéral, Monsieur le Président?
Honorable ministre des Finances.
Mr. Speaker, it is particularly ironic that members from a party that inherited a $13 billion surplus from a Liberal government in 2006 and then added $150 billion in debt to Canadians are talking to us about this. On top of that, they did it while creating the lowest rate of growth since the Great Depression, maybe because they spent the money on things like gazebos. We have a different plan. We are going to spend on productive assets that can help our country to do better in the future.
Honorable député de Beauce.
Monsieur le Président, on apprenait hier qu'après avoir fait campagne sur le dos des citoyens bien rémunérés et avoir augmenté leurs impôts, le gouvernement du Nouveau-Brunswick, le gouvernement libéral du Nouveau-Brunswick s'aperçoit que ça ne fonctionne pas, que les revenus de l'État ne sont pas là. Lorsqu'on augmente les impôts de l'ensemble des citoyens, on ne peut créer de la richesse. Pourquoi ce gouvernement-ci s'entête-t-il? Pourquoi le ministre des Finances s'entête-t-il à vouloir augmenter les impôts des Canadiens?
Honorable ministre des Finances.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to say how much I appreciate the question from the honourable member because it provides me with an opportunity to remind all the people here that we actually lowered taxes on 9 million Canadians. As of January 1st this year, 9 million Canadians have more money in their pocket. Now, it's true that we raised taxes on a very small proportion of Canadians that perhaps the honourable member is talking about. We recognize that we've helped the vast majority of people in this country.
Mr. Speaker, middle-class Canadians need Liberal governments to get out of the way and not raising their taxes. That's simple. If you keep raising taxes, you get fewer revenue and fewer jobs. When will the finance minister realize when he will realize that taxing Canadians it is not a solution for prosperity in this country?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians elected a new government on October 19th. They recognized that we had a plan. We had a plan to deal with low growth through bringing forward a new approach. We reduced taxes on the middle class, which will stimulate the economy while helping 9 million Canadians. We're going to help the most vulnerable people in this country by giving them a Canada Child benefit. We are going to stimulate the economy through infrastructure investments that can make a real long-term difference in productivity for this country.
The honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Trade Minister just signed the TPP, which will cost tens of thousands of good jobs across Canada. This deal was negotiated in secret, and many Canadians still aren't aware of the details. But the more they learn, the more they oppose the TPP. Maybe that's the reason the minister rushed to sign it without consulting Canadians and without any study of the economic impacts. How are Canadian workers supposed to trust in consultations with a minister that is in such a rush to sign away their jobs?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question. We signed the agreement precisely to give us the time to look at the accord, to look at the treaty in depth, to study it, to get the proper studies done, to do this work through our parliamentary committee. It's ratification that's important, Mr. Speaker. We have not taken a decision on ratification yet. We signed it in order to give us the time to look at this treaty properly.
The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Well, the reality is that the TPP is a threat to our economy.
Yeah,
And yes, and in Windsor, Tecumseh, and Essex County, we've already suffered hard blows to the auto sector, and we know, don't dismiss our concerns. We need meaningful consultation. The auto sector supports more than 120,000 good jobs in our province. But the trade minister, back in 2008, wanted to let the big three go bankrupt. And now she signed a bad deal that puts our auto jobs at risk again.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
I'd like to thank the member opposite, and I do appreciate the passion she's demonstrated, Mr. Speaker. The bottom line is we understand the importance of the automotive sector. It actually creates 500,000 direct and indirect jobs in Ontario, Mr. Speaker. That is why I went to Detroit to meet with the global heads of the OEMs to talk about investments in Canada, Mr. Speaker. We're going to be using the Automotive Innovation Fund, the Automotive Supplier Innovation Fund, to attract investments to create jobs in this very important sector, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Red Deer-Lacombe.
Mr. Speaker, the Immigration and Refugee Board website states, the reappointment process for IRB members will continue to reflect a performance evaluation consistent with the merit-based competency criteria. The Minister will continue to recommend the reappointment of members after taking note of the IRB chairperson's recommendations concerning performance and operational needs. Can the Government House Leader tell us, for the reappointed IRB members he has politically intimidated to resign, what specific problems with their performance were identified?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we've said over and over again that the problem with the performance was the previous government's attempt at 5 minutes to midnight to appoint a whole bunch of people to jobs that took effect after they lost the election. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a case of projection. The real scandal is on that side of the House, and they're somehow trying to project it over here.
The Honourable member for Red Deer-Lacombe.
This is outrageous. This is political interference in the courts. Is there any court in Canada that can escape the reach of this new Liberal government? No one has ever done this before. No one's even had the gall to attempt something like this before. Every minister in the past who's interfered with these tribunals has resigned. When's he going to get to it?
And why is he laughing?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Again, Mr. Speaker, what a surprise to hear a member from that party speaking about attempting to intimidate a court. Canadians were shocked and international jurists were shocked when that former government tried to intimidate publicly the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, and that's something that we'll never do.
The Honourable member for Wellington-Halton Hills.
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, when the Government House Leader was asked whether he and the Cabinet complied with the law by voting 4 times last November 5th, he said, I want to assure the House and the member that at all times, everyone on this side complied with all legislation. But Canadian press reported on November 5th that Liberal MPs chose unanimously to defer a decision on the rules, and the Government House Leader is reported as saying, we didn't think it was appropriate to vote. Can he explain this contradiction? Did he and his Cabinet colleagues vote 4 times in accordance with the law, yes or no?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the member is seeking to confuse 2 issues. The statute to which he referred refers to a caucus vote. Now, Mr. Speaker, a caucus vote is different than a cabinet vote, and the member has been in cabinet, and he knows the cabinet doesn't vote. So what he's trying to do is phrase a question to make it properly the business of the government when he knows very well that we answered that question after our first caucus meeting in November.
The member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, government ministers at all times must comply with the law, whether they are in caucus or out. The government doesn't get to pick and choose which laws they get to follow and which laws are appropriate for them to follow. They must follow the law. The rule of law is the most sacrosanct principle of our democracy. I encourage members opposite to Google Parliament of Canada Act, Section 49.
The member's an experienced member. He knows that props are not allowed in the House, so I'd ask him not to hold things up. We don't hold up any props, no matter what they are. The member knows that. I'd let to go on.
Mr. Speaker, I encourage members opposite to Google Parliament of Canada Act, read Section 49, and conclude themselves whether or not they follow the law on November 5th. My question is for the Attorney General. What is she going to do to uphold the rule of law and ensure that ministers acted in accordance with Section 49?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, you know very well that the Minister of Justice acts every day to uphold the rule of law. That's a fundamental responsibility that she takes very seriously. We're proud of the extraordinary way she does that, and the honourable member can be assured at all times, ministers, members of the caucus, and surely he would agree all members of Parliament uphold the rule of law.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagat.
Monsieur le Président, hier, Rona, une entreprise de chez nous, a été vendue à un géant américain. Rona, c'est 23 000 emplois, sans compter ses nombreux fournisseurs. Au même moment, le gouvernement signe le partenariat transpacifique, un accord qui va nous coûter 60 000 bons emplois, qui fragilise nos fermes familiales et qui va accélérer la prise de contrôle étrangère de nos entreprises. Pourquoi la ministre signe de toute évidence un accord qui s'en prend à nos emplois et à nos fermes laitières?
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'honorable membre pour sa question. Comme je viens de dire en anglais et en français aussi, nous allons signer justement pour nous donner le temps d'étudier l'accord comme il le faut devant ce Parlement à travers le comité. Si jamais on ratifie l'accord, on va travailler avec les secteurs affectés par l'accord et c'est un engagement qu'on avait pris lors de la campagne et c'est exactement ce qu'on est en train de faire, Monsieur le Président.
Honorable député de Rosemont-Pic-Patrie.
Monsieur le Président, quand on signe quelque chose, c'est parce qu'on met son accord puis on est d'accord. Tout le monde va comprendre ça, sauf le gouvernement libéral. Exact. Hier matin, les Québécois se sont levés avec une bien mauvaise nouvelle. Rona a été vendu à des intérêts américains. Pendant que les travailleurs ne savent pas qu'est-ce qui va leur arriver demain, les boss, eux autres, empochent 40 millions de dollars. Est-ce que le ministre s'engage à rendre public la révision obligatoire de cette prise de contrôle étrangère? Et si oui, est-ce qu'il va être capable de la déposer ici, au Parlement, pour que tout le monde soit au courant de ce qui se passe avec nos jobs chez nous?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire. Honorable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the concerns raised by the member opposite, and that is why the Investment Canada Act is very, very clear. Any transaction over $600 million automatically triggers a net benefit analysis. We have the resource and process in place to do that, Mr. Speaker. The Competition Bureau will also examine it from their perspective, Mr. Speaker. The shareholders have to look at it, Mr. Speaker. But the bottom line is any decision that we make will be in the best interest of Canadians and Quebecers.
Mr. Speaker, public safety officers put their lives on the line to keep us safe. Yet all too often they can't access the support they need to cope with the trauma experience that they live. The results can be devastating. 39 first responders died last year from suicide. Hundreds are affected by mental health crisis or operational stress injuries every year. Can the Minister of Public Safety update this House on his commitment to help public safety officers and their families deal with the threat of operational stress injuries?
For public safety.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to tell the House that this past week, dozens of leading experts, including those from the front line, met at the University of Regina to discuss a national strategy on post-traumatic stress injuries. My parliamentary secretary and I participated. First responders, those we asked to stand in harm's way to keep Canadians safe, rightfully deserve the highest level of care and support. The Minister of Health and I are mandated to ensure that that is in fact the case. We're grateful for all the national support and enthusiasm for that effort.
The honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have been all over the map on the fight against ISIS. The Defence Minister said and suggested that we're going to stop ISIS from spreading in Libya. The Minister of Global Affairs said, no, we're not. The Foreign Minister said Canada will focus on improving security in Jordan and Lebanon. And the Defence Minister said, no, we're going to stay in Iraq. Finally, when the Defence Minister was asked, what is the Liberals' anti-ISIS plan, he said, go ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's in Rome. Well, now the Minister is back from Rome. Has he given his Defence Minister his marching orders?
Hear, hear. The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to the former government, this government will act together on this issue to fight terrorism. It's why we work very hard to have an integrated plan with the Minister of Defense, who did a great job, the Minister of International Development, we did a great job, and I did my best as well, Mr. Speaker.
Excellent.
And with that, we'll work in complementarity with our allies, the coalition, to fight this awful terrorist group, and we will do it courageously and with efficacy.
The member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, again, there's no plan. Mr. Speaker, ISIS is a jihadi terrorist organization that is committing mass atrocities against religious and ethnic minorities. These are terrorists who believe in a dangerously radicalized version of Islam. The Liberals are constantly rationalizing their behavior and making excuses for ISIS. And now the Defence Minister is blaming climate change for ISIS. Does the Defence Minister actually believe that climate change creates jihadi terrorists?
And the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, as we know, the complexities of conflict, it takes a I'm happy to answer the question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the complexity of conflict, you have to look at many different aspects of what causes it. And when it comes to ISIL, Taliban, Boko Haram, and the atrocities that they commit, we have to be smart about it to making sure that these atrocities are not committed again. And we're going to take the time to make sure that we get this plan right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Député de Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, je pose la question, François va peut-être avoir une réponse. Depuis plusieurs jours, on demande au ministre de la Défense, c'est quoi le plan pour combattre l'État islamique? Il nous a répondu, c'est le ministre des Affaires étrangères qui s'en occupe pendant qu'il est à Rome. Le ministre des Affaires étrangères est de retour avec nous. Avez-vous transmis le plan au ministre de la Défense? Et est-ce qu'on peut le savoir, Monsieur le Président?
Ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Monsieur le Président, en effet, j'étais à Rome où j'ai participé à la rencontre de la coalition. Et à la coalition, j'ai fait savoir à quel point le Canada sera un partenaire fort et déterminé en complémentarité au travail des autres membres de la coalition. Et je peux lui dire que ce plan qui sera intégré, qui sera efficace, a été très bien reçu. Quoi, je n'ai pas pu en donner les détails puisque le premier ministre le fera. Et il le fera ici au Canada devant les Canadiens.
Député de Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, ça fait des semaines que le ministre de la Défense nous fait nager dans la confusion. On ne sait pas toujours comment nous combattrons le terrorisme. On n'est pas à chercher les raisons, c'est le temps de trouver les solutions. Le ministre est confus quand il parle des causes de la montée du terrorisme. Est-ce qu'il peut nous dire comment les changements climatiques aident les terroristes à tenir les couteaux pour couper des têtes et à poser les bombes?
Le ministre de la Défense nationale.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for that question and the complexity of conflict and the horrible, the atrocities that terrorists commit around the world. We have to be smarter in this fight because the threats are also increasing. And I will be taking the time to making sure that we get the right capabilities into the right areas at the right time so that we can fight this terrorist threat. Thank you.
The honourable member for Vancouver, Kingsway.
Speaker, prescription drug prices in Canada are already the second highest in the world. Wow. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership will increase the cost of prescription medicines even more. A new study released this week estimates the TPP will add over $600 million to drug costs in Canada. Mr. Speaker, too many Canadians already can't afford to purchase their medications. We need action to lower prices, not drive them up. So why is this government signing on to an agreement that will increase drug costs for Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for his question, and I agree with him that Canadians pay far too much for prescription drugs, and we do in fact pay the second highest per capita costs in the world. Part of my mandate is to address the rising costs of drugs, to make sure that prescription medicine is affordable and available to Canadians who need it. We intend to do that. We have a number of mechanisms by which we will do that. We have already taken steps in that regard, and I will continue to address this issue.
Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The previous Conservative government notoriously mismanaged the temporary foreign worker program and allowed abuse to flourish. It meant downward pressure on wages and working conditions for Canadian workers while encouraging the exploitation of foreign workers. Now the TPP is going to make this worse. Employers won't even have to show that they couldn't hire Canadians to do the job before bringing temporary foreign workers in. And I'm wondering if the Minister of Employment will stand today in the House and urge her government not to ratify the TPP unless changes are made to this clause to ensure it's not just bringing the TFW back to Canada through the back door.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. In our consultations thus far on the TPP, we have heard opinions for, we have seen studies for, we have heard opinions against, and have had representations against. We are taking all of them into consideration. That will be the work of the committee. That will be a decision made in front of this Parliament, and it will be this Parliament that decides whether or not we ratify the TPP, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's time for the government to clarify its foreign policy positions, given the confusion and contradictions coming from the Liberals. On one hand, the Foreign Minister has said that Canada will break from our Conservative government's principled positions on Russia and its illegal occupation of Ukraine. On the other hand, the Liberal MP for Etobicoke Centre said in Kiev this week there is no change in Canadian policy on Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, exactly who speaks on behalf of Liberal foreign policy?
Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, our position is very clear. It's only my colleague was a bit confused. So I will try to clarify again for him. So indeed, the support for Canada for Ukraine is solid and will remain. Our friendship for Ukraine is not a matter of party. It's not a matter of government. It's a friendship between two countries that will remain. Our ability to help Ukraine will be improved, though, because instead of snubbing Russia and not speaking to them, we'll speak to Russia and we'll tell them what we think, how much is wrong, what they are doing to Ukraine, as the other countries are doing. Our U.S. letting down.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Russia has failed to implement any of its commitments under the Minsk agreement with Ukraine. Fighting continues between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian rebels, despite the ceasefire. A buildup of additional Russian forces is reported along the border. Now, Ukraine has appealed for tough new sanctions and more weapons. And here the Minister of Trade and the Liberal MP for Etobicoke Centre are clearly at odds with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Why are the Liberals leaving the defence of Ukraine to others, just as they're doing in the fight against ISIS terrorists?
Hear, hear.
Now the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to answer by a quote, and that's the quote. I believe Canada will be strong and firm in its pressure on Russia. Who said that? The Prime Minister of Ukraine. So that's the point. If the government of Ukraine understands it, I'm sure my colleague will.
Bravo. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, the U.S. Senate hearing on Canadian fast-tracking of Syrian refugees heard yesterday it would almost be impossible for Canadian officials to acquire the specialized skills needed to screen refugees under the pressure of the Liberal election timeline. My question is for the chair of the Public Safety Committee. This morning, Liberals on that committee blocked a study on refugee security screening. Why is the safety of Canadians not important enough for the committee to study it immediately?
The Honourable Chair of the Public Safety Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. The committee met for the first time this morning and established a process whereby we'll look at all important issues and determine which ones need to come first, and every issue dealing with the safety and security of Canadians will be considered seriously. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for West Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, a fishing boat called the Jill Marie and its crew ran into trouble off the coast of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. As you know, our oceans can become dangerous for fishermen with unexpected changes in weather. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans explain to the House the response of the Canadian Coast Guard to this crisis situation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries.
Le Centre conjoint de coordination des opérations de sauvetage à Halifax a répondu à un appel de détresse de bateaux de la pêche Jill Mary et la garde côtière canadienne est rapidement intervenue. Un aéronef des Forces armées canadiennes et le navire Spray de la garde côtière ont été envoyés pour l'opération de recherche et de sauvetage. Les 5 pêcheurs à bord ont été rescapés avant que le bateau ait coulé et ils sont sains et saufs au grand soulagement de leur famille. Il s'agit de l'une des 9000 opérations de sauvetage effectuées chaque année par la garde côtière. J'invite tous les membres de la Chambre des communes à reconnaître le travail de ces hommes et ces femmes au niveau de la garde côtière, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
Mr. Speaker, while we recognize this as National Suicide Prevention Week, suicide continues to be a major national public health issue in Canada. In December of 2012, Bill C-300, an act pertaining to a federal framework for suicide prevention, was passed into law. This framework will help the hundreds of Canadians across Canada who are working with some of Canada's most vulnerable people. Can the Minister of Health inform this House as to when we can expect some information as to when this bill will actually be implemented? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for his question, and I thank him also for his tireless advocacy work on behalf of this important issue. I am pleased to inform him that as a result of his work in the past, the Public Health Agency of Canada has been working on the federal framework on suicide prevention. In fact, I have just seen an almost final copy of that framework. I would be happy to meet with the member opposite to discuss it at any time, and we will continue to work to address this very serious matter to prevent suicide in this country.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Governments in the past have chosen conflict over cooperation and unilaterally changed voting rules in a often self-serving manner. With the commitment that October 19th was the last first-past-the-post election, we must now create a voting system that truly respects and reflects the wishes of Canadians. And they expect that the committee tasked with this momentous responsibility must also respect and reflect their wishes. Will the minister agree to our proposal to work with the NDP, the Conservatives, the Bloc and the Greens and seize this historic opportunity together?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to make something perfectly clear. The reforms we choose must be designed to address the needs of all Canadians and go far beyond addressing the interests of the parties we represent. I urge all members in this House to adopt the same principle and work with us as we enhance our democratic institutions and serve the best interests of Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the 150th anniversary of our nation's capital draws near, many of my constituents feel that Ottawa have not received equal treatment from economic development agencies over the last decade to help develop local projects and strengthen the local economy. In fact, Ottawa received less than $1 per capita in federal development agency funding. Can the minister assure my constituents and all residents of Ottawa region that we will be treated fairly when it comes to economic development projects?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for that very important question, Mr. Speaker. The National Capital Region is not just home to an amazing public service, but it's home to a dynamic, innovative, high-tech industry. And I'm working to support startups, scale-ups, and helping high-growth firms in Ottawa and across the country, Mr. Speaker. And we look forward to working in partnership with my colleagues as we gear up to celebrate Canada's 150th anniversary here in the National Capital Region and across Canada.
Honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stats Canada estimates there are over 1 million blind or partially visually disabled Canadians. However, only 7% of literature is available in accessible formats like Braille, large print, and audio formats. The Marrakesh Treaty amends copyright rules to give visually impaired Canadians access to 285,000 accessible books. Now, Mr. Speaker, we recently introduced legislation in the previous Parliament to adopt this treaty here in Canada. That was interrupted by the election. I wonder if the government of the day would consider reintroducing that legislation so it can be passed forthwith.
The Minister for People with Disabilities.
I thank the member opposite for his question. I'm very proud, Mr. Speaker, to support the work of my colleague, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, as he leads our work on the Marrakesh Treaty. Over 1 million Canadians who suffer from vision loss, including myself, really have a necessity to have this kind of alternate format. I'm very proud to be part of a government that triumphs and trumpets accessibility and inclusion, and I look forward to bringing this to the House. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Pierre Boucher, la Pétrade Verchères.
Monsieur le Président, les médias du Canada anglais se mêlent du débat entourant la vente de Rona pour dire au gouvernement de ne rien faire. Rona, c'est 23 000 emplois au Québec, dont 1 000 emplois au siège social de Boucherville dans ma circonscription. C'est 2 milliards d'achats auprès des fournisseurs québécois. C'est aussi un groupe de travail de protection qui s'est penché. Le groupe de travail sur la protection des entreprises québécoises. Aussi, j'ai l'ex-ministre libéral Monique Jérôme-Forget qui disait que les sièges sociaux sont des moteurs économiques. Est-ce que le ministre va s'engager à protéger nos emplois, Monsieur le Président?
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. As I said yesterday to the member, this is a very important issue, and therefore the Investment Canada Act is very clear when it comes to the net benefit analysis that's done. Because this transaction is close to $3.2 billion, Mr. Speaker, it will automatically trigger a net benefit analysis. We will make sure that we have the appropriate resources and process in place to do the analysis. And like I mentioned before, Mr. Speaker, the Competition Bureau will look at it, the shareholders will look at it, but the bottom line is we will do what's in the best interest of Canadians and Quebecers.
L'honorable député de Joliette.
Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement du Québec, via la Caisse de dépôt, peut accepter de vendre ses actions de Rona, ce qui permet la transaction, ou il peut aussi refuser de les vendre, ce qui la bloque. Si jamais il accepte la vente, il y a une chose qu'il ne peut pas faire: poser des conditions qui vont contraindre l'OSE à respecter ses engagements sur le siège social, sur les emplois, sur la chaîne d'approvisionnement et sur les PME qui en dépendent. Ça, c'est ce gouvernement-ci qui peut le faire. Le ministre s'engage-t-il à poser des conditions pour protéger nos PME et pour garantir l'activité économique au Québec?
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the member opposite that this government is very committed to making sure that we have strong Canadian businesses from coast to coast to coast. When it comes to this particular transaction, Mr. Speaker, there are clear guidelines set in the Investment Canada Act, the legislative framework that makes it very clear that there's a process in place to deal with these kinds of transactions. The bottom line is jobs are important, making sure that we have the best interests of Canadians is important, Mr. Speaker. So we'll make sure that we follow the process, we have the resources in place, and we'll make sure we do what's good for Quebecers and Canadians.